Hey y'all, it's Shannon, your favorite podcast editor. Just cutting in here at the beginning to let you know there's a weird clicking sound that starts with my audio, probably about a third of the way through and continues through the rest of the episode. Uh, it's a problem with my microphone that I've had a couple times, so now I think I need to figure out what's with that. But, um, but yeah, just wanted to cut in to say that, like, I removed it as much as possible, and there's a section of the podcast that I cut out because of the audio problems and for length, but so you'll hear my voice somewhere in the middle about, and I sound very different because I've been a little bit sick. So just know that that's why I just re-recorded a little bit to get us from point A to point B. Um, Very sorry about the audio problems, but I hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Colleen.
And I'm Shannon.
And this is Pop Culture Pie, where two sisters talk about stuff. One sister
Yay.
picks a topic and surprises the other one. Shannon picked the topic this time. Shannon, what are you serving today?
Today, I'm serving a slice of The Adventure Zone.
What is that?
The Adventure Zone is my favorite podcast. So
I thought this was your favorite podcast.
It's my second favorite it's my favorite podcast I'm not on.
How many podcasts are you on?
I guess technically 4.
You're famous.
I wish. So, The Adventure Zone, I'm obsessed with it. It's like my favorite thing. And it has been for like the past year almost. Do you know anything about The Adventure Zone from what I've mentioned when I'm like my favorite podcast?
No. I mean, I'm sure you've told me about it, and as you talk about it, I'm probably going to be like, oh, yeah, you said that one time.
Okay. Well, I thought it would be interesting to do an episode where you don't know anything about what I'm talking about. So, The Adventure Zone is an actual play. Well, it started as an actual play Dungeons and Dragons podcast. By these 3 brothers and their dad. So, I figured I'd give the basics of the family, the McElroys. That's their name.
See, that sounds familiar.
Yeah. The 3 brothers are Justin, Travis, and Griffin. And they have been hosting a podcast together for, I think, 7 years called My Brother, and Me. Or Mabim Bam for short. And it is a comedy advice show. And people send in advice questions. And they answer them in funny ways. And then the other half of the show is they take, like, terrible Yahoo Answers questions and answer those in funny ways. So they do not give actual advice, you may have guessed. Well, sometimes they do, but not really. So Justin is the oldest, Travis is the middleest, and Griffin is the, quote, sweet baby brother.
Middleist is not a word.
Yeah, that's how they introduce themselves at the beginning of every My Brother, and Me episode. Griffin was also named a 30 under 30 media luminary, I think a little over a year ago. So he always introduces himself as the sweet baby brother and 30 under 30 media luminary Griffin McElroy.
I don't know what that means.
It's the Forbes list.
Oh.
Forbes 30 under 30.
Okay.
So he was 29 at the time, and now he is 30.
I'm 29.
Yeah. I think Justin is 37, and Travis is like 34. Travis and Justin have the same birthday, which would be terrible for Griffin. So they host My Brother, and Me. They also host a bunch of other podcasts. They each host a podcast with their wife. Justin and his wife, Sydney, who is a doctor, host Sawbones, which is a medical history podcast. Travis and his wife, Teresa, host Schmanners, which is an etiquette podcast. And Griffin and his wife, Rachel, used to host Rose Buddies, which was a Bachelor family of products fan cast. But then the Bachelor franchise just got too terrible. So now they host Wonderful, which is a show about things they like.
These guys got some pretty understanding wives.
Yeah, the wives are all wonderful. They are all very sweet. Justin and Griffin have kind of real jobs. They work for Polygon, which is a video games website. So I first was introduced to the McElroys because they have a lot of internet things. I was first introduced through Monster Factory, which is a show that Justin and Griffin do for Polygon, where they basically go into a video game. They pick video games with really good character creation, and they make a monster, and then they play the game in a ridiculous way. And my friend Jules introduced me to that, and it's very funny. They also have other video game series though, and have done reviews of video games and stuff. Travis is now his job is just podcasting, and he hosts, I think, half of all podcasts on the web. He hosts a news podcast called Trends Like These, Schmanners, obviously. He hosts a Doctor Who fan cast. He hosts a show called Surprisingly Nice. He produces a show called Can I Pet Your Dog? Bunker Buddies. He does a lot of shows. I do not listen to all of them, but I know them all. So that's the brothers. Their dad is Clint McElroy, who was a professional radio host. He is now retired, but yeah, so that is who they are. So the Adventure Zone started in August 2014, and it was a filler episode for My Brother, and Me, because Justin and his wife had a baby. And so they were instead of doing a full episode, we're just going to record us playing Dungeons and Dragons. And now I'm pretty sure it's, maybe other than My Brother, and Me, I think it's their most popular thing on the internet. We made you a Dungeons and Dragons character, but we didn't fully make it. Other than that, how much do you know about Dungeons and Dragons?
I know what I have inferred from Darths and Droids.
Yeah.
For the audience, Darths and Droids is a webcomic where people from Australia have taken the screenshots from all the Star Wars movies and recaptioned them as though it is a Dungeons and Dragons-like game.
It's pretty great, and I need to catch up on it.
Yeah, it's pretty hilarious, and so it starts at episode 1 and goes through episode 6.
And it has been going on for 10 years.
Yeah, and the thing I love about it is the way they things that don't make sense in the movies that they explain, Jar Jar Binks exists because one of the guys had to bring his little sister, and so they were like, do you want to be an alien? And she's like, yeah, I'm an alien with bunny ears and a horse nose and a frog and it's a kid, so then you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, Darth and Droids was pretty much where I started to learn all of my Dungeons and Dragons stuff, and then I listened to the Adventure Zone, and I learned more, and now I play Dungeons and Dragons. The thing with Darths and Droids is it's not technically Dungeons and Dragons.
No, it's a Dungeons and Dragons-like game.
Yeah, so they can do whatever they want when they need to. But, I mean, it's basically Dungeons and Dragons. That's why it's called Darths and Droids. The Adventure Zone is sometimes very loose with the rules of Dungeons and Dragons as well, because none of them knew how to play. And arguably none of them knew how to play by the end of it either. So for like 3 years, they played this one campaign of Dungeons and Dragons. So a campaign is like one storyline, basically, and you have the same characters. Or if your character dies, you make a new character, but it's the same world. There's player characters, PCs, and then NPCs, non-player characters. And the game is played by rolling dice. You have a d20, that's the main die. It has 20 sides. And then a few other types of dice. And then you have stats for different things. Like the main stats are dexterity, strength, intelligence, wisdom, and constitution. And then those are divided up more among like athletics, acrobatics, history, insight, stuff like that.
I bought myself dice.
Yeah, we need to play sometime.
I don't know where those dice are.
Wow. Yeah, so they are playing 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which is the most recent one and the only one I've played. But I know there are differences between editions, because sometimes in the Adventure Zone, Griffin is like, make a bluff check, but bluff is not a thing in 5th edition, and they're like, you mean a deception check? So the Dungeon Master, the DM, runs the game. And you can get, like, pre-written playbooks where it's almost a choose-your-own-adventure, where the Dungeon Master is reading out of this playbook, and it kind of gets to points where it's like, okay, if the players do this, or they do this, but it's a lot of improvising, and I think with the playbooks, I mean, I've only played with a playbook a little bit, but it's more like, okay, theoretically, they will eventually accomplish this goal in this section. They can figure out how they want to do it. It's just the Dungeon Master's job to, like, give them information and then tell them when to roll checks and tell them, like, what happens based on how well they do, how well they roll the checks and stuff. That's kind of Dungeons & Dragons. So, in the Adventure Zone, Griffin is the DM, at least in this first campaign they did, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about, because they have wrapped up that campaign, they wrapped up the storyline, and have retired those characters, basically. But so Griffin is the DM, and then Justin, Travis, and Clint are all the players. So Justin plays Taco, who is an elven wizard. That's his race and class. That's what every Dungeons & Dragons character is, a race and a class. Travis plays Magnus the Hammer Burnsides, who is a human fighter, but later on in the game he multi-classes as a rogue. Because Travis was like, man, I wish I could do flips. I don't know. And be sneaky. Because Magnus's whole thing is Magnus rushes in, so he is not sneaky at all. And then Clint plays Merle Highchurch, who is a dwarven cleric. So he is the healer when he remembers to heal them. And then Griffin plays every other character. Because he is the Dungeon Master. Mm-hmm. So some important non-player characters are the director, who is kind of their boss, Angus MacDonald, who is a boy detective, Killian, who's this orc woman and kind of introduces them into the main plot, Kravitz, who is a Grim Reaper, and then the Voidfish, who the plot kind of centers around. So the basic premise of the show is these 3 guys are on like a regular D&D adventure. They're transporting goods for Gundren Rockseeker. And then And this starts as Griffin was going out of the, what's it called? The, like, starter handbook. You can buy this starter kit that basically has a pretty simple game in there and, like, pre-rolled characters. Mm-hmm. So Justin and Clint are using characters that have already been rolled. Like, they didn't completely create them. Whereas Travis had played Dungeons and Dragons before, so he completely created a character. But so they start kind of with this already written story, but then Griffin pretty quickly starts to make up his own story and goes off the rails, and they end up working for the Bureau of Balance, which is an organization whose base is on a fake moon, and they get there via these kind of cannonball spaceships. It goes from fantasy to sci-fi very quickly. But in that way that, like, Buffy can be fantasy and sci-fi, where it's, like, balanced in a way that makes sense. And I always like stuff that is like that.
Sure.
And they work for the Bureau of Balance, which basically... The director is like, there are these 7 relics that are very dangerous. Mm-hmm. And we need people to collect them. Are you with me so far?
Have you been talking?
Yeah. So, they need to collect these relics. And so there's 7 of them. And they're not Horcruxes. So then they basically have, like, little story arcs, kind of campaigns within the campaign. So then they're, like, that first one they do is based off the playbook, and it's more like regular Dungeons & Dragons fantasy, except they're all comedians, so it's very funny. The second one they do is, like, a train murder mystery. They do one that's like race car thing. It's very like Mad Max Fury Road. They do one that's more sci-fi, where they're in, like, not in a spaceship, but it's technically a, like, floating science lab. But they're, like, trapped in there.
So these are all, like, little missions within the overarching...
Yeah, so each one is probably, like, 10 episodes long, and then the episodes are, like, an hour to an hour and a half. And then in between each one, there are lunar interludes, which is where they do, like, 1 or 2 episodes on the moon base and kind of do character development things. So it starts as this very, like, silly show. It's like this family playing Dungeons and Dragons. And by the end, it's kind of, like, crazy to listen to one of the first episodes and then listen to, like, the last episode, because it's this really fleshed out world, and, like, they get into some, like, I don't know, serious topics. Makes it sound like it's, like, after school special, but, like, it becomes a very, like, serious plot, and Griffin, like, really thought out the plot. Like, you can tell, and they have little kind of behind the scenes episodes that they called the Adventure Zone. Actually, the Adventure Zone, where they answer people's questions and things. And in the last one, like, he talks about how during, like, one of the middle arcs is when he really started to figure out what the end game was. And when I just re-listened to it all, and you do get to, like, that arc, and you do start to realize, like, oh, this is when he started dropping all these hints. And it's crazy because he says, like, he's never written fiction before. But he's really good at it. But it's not traditional writing, and it's not traditional storytelling. It's like, okay. And that's the weird but cool thing about Dungeons & Dragons, is, like, like, I play with my friends and we do our podcast Daring Fables, and it's like, okay, I have written a story. I'm the dungeon master. And I have written this story, but I have not created the characters. These other people have created the characters and are now trying to play my story. It's like writers will talk about, like, oh, the character just does whatever it wants. Like, it's almost like I don't control them, like writing books. Which I understand what writers mean when they talk about that, because, like, I have written books and short stories. But this is that, but literally. Like, I do not control the characters in any way. And so it's very interesting to listen to a show that's 4 guys who 3 of them have no idea where the story is going, but they are essentially co-writing it. And then they still somehow create this cohesive story. And part of that is probably their family. They have always worked together. They're very funny people. And so they play off each other in the right way to make these compelling characters and story. But it's kind of wild sometimes to re-listen to stuff and be like, there's foreshadowing here, but they didn't know it was foreshadowing. Or, like, Griffin probably knew that it was foreshadowing, but, like, the other 3 don't. And it's weird how, like, they'll end up with these really perfect parallel scenes that show, like, character development. I've written all about it on my Tumblr. And not to brag, but I have, like, 1,000 notes. And then they're just, like, really great people, and they strive to have a lot of good representation. So, like, Taco is gay, and, like, none of, like, they're all, you know, cisgender, straight, white men. But Justin has talked about, like, when he makes video game characters, he always tries to make them, or not necessarily tries to make them, but he tends to make them very different from himself. And so when making Taco, he kind of, like, realized, oh, I think Taco's gay. And so then Taco, like, gets a boyfriend and goes on a date. And the fans loved it and were like, why doesn't Taco go on more dates? And Justin and Griffin were like, because it's weird for us to go on a date. Like, but it's still very sweet, like, and they do go out of their way to include that, and, like, not to spoil it. I mean, I don't necessarily think you'll ever listen to it, but for listeners who might, they, a character's introduced pretty late in the story, and they're like, well, she's a trans woman, and it doesn't really, it's not necessarily, like, important to the story, but, like, they wanted to make sure they had that representation. And then, like, it's an audio medium, but they still make sure that they're people of color. So, like, the director is described as having dark skin. And there are a few other characters that aren't necessarily described that way, but, like, fan artists have basically decided, like, Kravitz is black. And now, like, I'm so used to that I couldn't imagine Kravitz being white. Mm-hmm. Taco, I mean, his name is spelled Taako, but it's, like, Taco. A lot of people have, like, decided he's Mexican. And he kind of has a thing where he's trying to figure out the recipe for a taco. He's a celebrity chef in World, and his whole thing is, like, I'm Taco, you know, from TV. And Justin is, like, from TV, and Griffin's like, TVs don't exist in this world. So you weren't on TV, you were a traveling chef in a wagon. But then, like, being cisgender straight white men, they mess up a lot on representation. So, like, in one story, there's 2 women who are in love. And it's not really explicitly stated, but, like, it's very obvious they're in love. And they die. And not in a, like, gameplay sort of way, like in a way where it was like, okay, this is how Griffin like wrote the story. Not like sometimes in Dungeons and Dragons, like characters just die because they're in a battle. And then people pointed out to Griffin, like it's in a very like beautiful way, but people pointed out to Griffin like, hey, there's a trope where women loving women tend to get killed off a lot in a like tragic but beautiful way. Mm-hmm. And he profusely apologized and then went out of his way to add more women loving women characters and kind of like make up for it. That's which nice. Is the way, yeah, it's the way to like handle that sort of thing.
Yeah.
A lot of like TV writers or whatever would be like, well, but that's just the way like the story went. Sorry. And it's like, but, you know, because I get it, like, you can't go back and change it. Mm-hmm. But it's like, there are things that you can do to show that you will do better in the future and that you're actually sorry.
Yeah. Well, there's a balance, too, because sometimes, like, if you make a mistake because you don't know better, people won't forgive you in a way, and they'll still be... And you're like, but I didn't know. Like, I didn't... There has to be some level of understanding for, like, things that, you know, are outside of the typical society.
Yeah. And that's basically, he was like, I didn't know this was a trope. And I think, you know, with some, like, TV writers who have kind of fallen into this trope, I think a lot of times when someone kind of points out that you're being, like, quote-unquote problematic, you want to get defensive because you think, like, I'm not a problematic person. I don't hate gay people, whatever. And it's like, you know, a lot of times, like, I understand you probably don't hate gay people, but they get defensive and then don't, like, really apologize or try to make up for it because they're like, well, I didn't really do anything wrong. But it's like, or you can just be like, oh, I'm really sorry, I didn't know that was a thing. I'm gonna show how I will do better in the future. Mm-hmm. And he definitely did that, and I appreciate it a lot. And that's like, they kind of, you know, with Taco, like, being gay, they really emphasize, like, because, like, Justin at one point, so Taco goes on a date in one of the lunar interludes. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the ones where each of the 3 player characters have, like, a little mini story. And they bring up, like, later in that episode when they're all back together, like, the next episode, like, did you guys tell each other what you did? Because, like, Merle's story is kind of a secret or whatever. Mm-hmm. And they all are kind of like, oh, I don't know. And Justin kind of says, like, he doesn't necessarily think Taco would tell them, like, oh, I went on a date. But he was like, but I want to make it clear, it's not because Taco's like, oh, I don't want them to know I'm gay. It's just because Taco's like, you don't need to know about my personal life. Which is very in character for Taco. Mm-hmm. And he kind of brings that up a few other times when something comes up, where he's like, but I want to make it clear, it's not like, he didn't want the character to be about being gay because he's not gay. Mm-hmm. So, like, he can't represent that. Mm-hmm. Which is another important thing where it's like, you know, I think sometimes writers are scared to write gay characters or black characters or whatever when they are not that thing. But it's more important to have the representation, and it's like, just write it but not make it about that.
Yeah. But I think, you know, so many times people try to do that and then everyone gets upset, and it's like, well, wouldn't you have been upset if they left you out? Like, what? Yeah. What is the winning, you know, here?
Yeah, it's like, it's sometimes hard to balance. And it's hard to know if you're getting it right. Like, sometimes I think that when I'm writing, like, people of color, I'm like, you know, especially when because most of the writing I do is like written words, so it's like you have to like bring up that they're a person of color to make sure that like the representation is in there.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, I don't know, like sometimes I am like, I don't know if I'm doing this right, which is why like book writers have sensitivity readers. I just read a good article about sensitivity reading, and let me bring it back up. Yeah, it was on Vulture, and it's called What the Job of a Sensitivity Reader is Really Like by Lila Shapiro. And it's mostly about this one woman. I am not sure how to pronounce her first name. I assume Danielle. Donielle, Danielle Clayton. And she's one of the chief executives of We Need Diverse Books, a nonprofit to support writers from marginalized groups and to advocate for more diversity. But she's a sensitivity reader, and so sensitivity readers will, read a book and give feedback about, like if it's a person of color, like this woman is, will give feedback about the characters of color that the people wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about kind of like some people get really defensive. They're usually very shocked about like the fact that they messed up. I'm finding a good quote. Yeah, so the question is like, when you're doing a sensitivity read and you come across a problematic character storyline, how do you handle it? And she says, I try to explain it as best I can. Most people are shocked by the blind spots they discover. I read a middle grade book about a little black girl who loves to go to national parks, and I told the author that the first thing she needed to reconcile was, how did this black girl get into national parks? Historically, black people weren't allowed to visit national parks. So going to national parks is not a thing we do as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's a really interesting thing that, like, obviously a white person isn't going to think of unless they have done a lot of research or, they've spoken to a lot of black people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why, like, there are sensitivity readers. But not everyone will go to sensitivity readers. Not everyone will even think to do that.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, I bookmarked this article because, like, I knew it was a thing, but I didn't know a lot about it, so I really liked reading this article. Because I've seen, like, authors, I follow a lot of authors on Twitter, I've seen them kind of put out calls for sensitivity readers. Yeah, for various things. Because it is, like, no matter how much research you do, you're still not that person.
Yeah.
So you could still do something wrong.
As someone who works with artists,
yeah,
they're very sensitive about their creations, and
yeah,
they don't like hearing that they made a mistake because it's their art, and you can't make a mistake in art.
Yeah, and I think in this article she talks about, like, there are people where she tells them, like, this is the problem, and then they don't fix it. Because they don't necessarily have to.
Mm-hmm.
Even just, like, working with an editor when writing a book, like, you don't necessarily have to do everything the editor tells you, depending on what kind of editing they're doing. Obviously, if they're fixing spelling and grammar, you want to fix that. But, if they suggest something about the plot, that's something that maybe you talk to them about. It also depends on, like, how famous of an author you are and, like, what your contract is with, like, because sometimes, like, if it's the editor with, like, the publishing house, it's like, we need you to do this so that we can publish the book.
Yeah, that can be we won't publish the book. Like,
yeah. But, like, I'm sure, J.K. Rowling working with an editor, it's like, what do you think of this? And the editor's like, well, I think you could do it this way. And J.K. Rowling could be like, well, I don't like that, so
I won't.
Yeah. But yeah, so now we've gone off on a tangent about, like, representation and writing good representation. But that's, like, I think that these guys handle it well. And a lot of their, I mean, they don't do like other fiction work, but they, in My Brother and Me, which let me double check how long that has actually been going on since I reference it. 2010. Yeah, so it's actually going to be 8 years this year. All the time in the show now, they say, like, don't listen to the old episodes. Because, like, 8 years ago, they were straight white men on the internet and they didn't know anything yet. So they made, like, offensive jokes and stuff. And they're like, we have learned better. And we don't make those jokes anymore. And it's really terrible to listen to. Please don't listen to our old episodes. And I'm like, I will take that to heart because I don't want to listen to that. But that's like, there are other people who have been, on the internet for 8 years and have gained probably, the same amount of celebrity status as them but have not corrected that kind of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And would just be like, oh, but I'm just making jokes. And it's like, but jokes can really affect how people view the world. If you make, like, a racist joke, that gives a racist the,
Validation.
that makes them think, yes, validation. Gives them validation. They're like, oh, it's okay for me to be racist because this guy thinks it's funny. And it's like, no, it's not funny. But yeah, so concerning the Adventure Zone and race, it's come up a lot they have a graphic novel coming out later this year, this summer. And, people headcanon these characters in a lot of different ways. And there's been a little bit of controversy about how to represent the characters in a physical format that isn't necessarily the, like, quote-unquote canon way, but lots of people have different headcanons about these characters, and there's been a little bit of controversy around, like, Taco, and, lots of people headcanon Taco as Mexican, but is making him, like, canonically, quote-unquote, Mexican. Well, that could come across as racist to someone who is, picking up this graphic novel for the first time if he's represented there, or someone who's encountering fan art for the first time because they could think, oh, the joke is that he's Mexican and his name is Taco. It's kind of this weird thing where it's like, because they're white, they can't, like, accurately represent it. But, like, it's kind of what we were talking about earlier. Like, if they try to represent it, like, what does that mean?
Yeah,
it's like...
You could get in trouble because you represented it wrong, but you would get in trouble if you didn't represent it at all.
Yeah. And that's, like, I feel kind of weird, like, listening to the show and thinking of the characters that these white men are playing as, like, not white, just because it makes me feel weird to think that, like, they're playing not white characters. Obviously, it's not as bad as, like, going on television with blackface, but, like,
yeah.
And, they're obviously not, thinking of the characters in any visual way, but that's, like, sometimes, I feel weird about, like, straight people playing gay characters. Like, not super weird, it's just kind of like, oh, like, you don't know that experience. And also, a gay person could have played them.
But, like, have you ever seen Will and Grace?
No, but...
The lead actor in Will and Grace is straight.
Yeah.
And, I mean, he's won Emmys and Gold Globes, and that's a great show. And it's a great representation.
And from what I know about Will and Grace is, like, it's done a really good job.
Yeah. But then it's like, my concern if you get into, like, okay, well, only, gay people should play gay people, then you're going to be like,
Yeah.
well, only straight people should play straight people. And I think about Neil Patrick Harris, whose most favorite character is a womanizer.
Yeah.
And he was great at it.
Yeah.
And that just, that gets into, like, where's the line of, like, what is acting and what, you know, is like, okay, well, you should have found someone more appropriate. I don't know what that line is, you know, like, I don't know, you know, but those are my two examples of, like, a gay person playing a straight person and a straight person playing a gay person, and they both do a great job.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like, I mean, obviously, it should be more strict with race. Like, obviously. But also, like, I, you know, saw something recently about, like, a lot of voice acting. Like, there's been a lot of white voice actors who are voicing people of color. And the voice actors don't necessarily know that before they go in. But, like Kubo and the Two Strings is obviously, I mean, I haven't seen it, but it's obviously, like, an, you know, Asian-inspired aesthetic, but it's mostly white people voicing it. And not necessarily to say, like, anything about the quality of that movie. Like I said, I haven't seen it. But Coco, which just came out, is...
Which she has also not seen, but is great.
Which I've also not seen.
I've seen it, and it's wonderful, and it is voiced by Hispanic actors.
And not just Hispanic actors, but, like, as far as I know, they're all Mexican.
Or of Mexican heritage.
Or of Mexican heritage, or most of them are. And so it's like, that was something that, like, when I looked at the cast list and I was clicking on all their names to see, I was like, this should be, like, the bare minimum. Like, yes, it's a Mexican character, so it's played by a Mexican voice actor, but it still, like, blew me away when I realized that.
Yeah, because
they actually did that.
The only white person is John Ratzenberger, who's been in every Pixar movie ever, and so he's in the movie. He, you know, has, like, 2 lines, and he's just some silly little character. And
I know that they kind of were like, how do we fit John in? Because we, like, have to. So yeah, and then, like, with, like, sexuality, it's a little different, because, like, your appearance doesn't matter. Whereas, like, with trans characters, I think transgender actors should play trans characters. I was talking to a trans person once about this, and she actually,
I was gonna say, I've never heard of a transgender character not being played by a transgender actor. I mean, you just don't see transgender characters very often.
You don't, but The Danish Girl, starring Eddie Redmayne, as a transgender woman, and then I don't remember what the movie was, but, like, Jared Leto played a trans woman.
Oh, that's right.
So it's usually, like, cisgender men playing transgender women, or vice versa. Because filmmakers think, like, oh, well, not necessarily that the filmmakers are thinking, like, they were a man, which is not the right way to think of it, but they're at least thinking, like, appearance-wise, this is more what they look like.
Yeah.
But it's like, that is not accurate.
That's not the point.
Yeah, and it is, like, that very much is also an issue of taking roles away from trans actors. Because, like, a trans actor is probably not going to get cast as a cisgender character. Whereas, like, a gay actor could get cast as a straight character. And so you just don't see very many trans actors out there. Like, Laverne Cox is obviously pretty big now, but, like, what other trans actors could you name? I cannot name any. I know there's
Chaz Bono.
That's, yes.
Sonny and Cher's child.
I know that Mrs. Hudson in Elementary is trans, but I don't know that actor's name.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes.
Oh, Elementary. I thought
she's
Sherlock. I don't watch Elementary, but cool.
She's not in it very much from what I know. She's just in a couple episodes. But I talked to a trans woman once, and like she said, she thinks like it would be better to cast a cisgender woman as a trans woman than to cast a cisgender man. Which I had never thought about it that way, but then like
I mean that makes sense. You feel as the transgender person feel like a woman, so a woman should be playing the character.
Yeah. Like you wouldn't cast a, like you wouldn't think of like, oh, I'm going to cast a man to play a woman, but that's what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Anyway, the Adventure Zone.
I was going to say we've really changed topics here.
But see, that's why I like this show. It inspires so many interesting conversations. Even though it's 3 cisgender straight white men. 4. So anyway, they wrapped up that whole first campaign, which is the balance arc. And now they're doing experimental arcs. The first one they did was Taz Commitment. And they're trying to play other games other than Dungeons and Dragons, which I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I know that's good for them. They get to play other games, and they're also kind of trying to figure out like what is best for the storytelling that we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, I don't know this game now. So Commitment, they played the game Fate, which I still do not understand. But it was, their dad was the game master. And it was a game, the story was like a story that he had pitched as a graphic novel, like decades ago or something, because he's like helped write graphic novels before. Mm-hmm. And so he's the one who's like writing their graphic novel. But it's superheroes. And so Justin's character is Irene Baker. And her power is she transforms into Cardala, which now I need to make sure I get this all right. So she transforms into Cardala, who is a thunder goddess, inspired by Kadlu, who is an actual goddess in Inuit mythology. And Justin did a ton of research into like Inuit mythology, like emailed people who are experts on it to like make sure he played this character in a podcast correctly. Uh-huh. He was like, it was really weird to try to explain to them what I was doing. But again, it's that, like, he went out of his way to make sure he did it right. And then Travis played Nadia Jones, and her power is basically Mr. Fantastic. Well, she doesn't stretch, but she can, like, turn her hands into tools, and she's also just really, really smart. And she is British Bangladeshi. And then Griffin was Remy, and he was basically Spider-Man. And so he was really good at like jumping and stuff. And there wasn't necessarily anything about him that was like, oh, he's great representation, but you know, you can interpret him however you want. It was funny because Griffin did like all of these great voices throughout the first campaign, and then when it came around to this, he just did his own voice, and he was like, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I've been thinking about like what is Remy's voice, and I realized it's exactly like mine. But the other brothers do like voices for their characters, and so they wrapped that one up after like 4 episodes, and now they're doing Amnesty, which Griffin is mastering again, and it is the Powered by the Apocalypse game system, which Griffin kind of used for a little story arc they did in the first campaign. And specifically it's the Monster of the Week like specialization, I guess. I don't know a lot about it, but I understand it a little bit more than the Fate game. But it's Monster of the Week. He keeps referencing Buffy and Supernatural, and it's similar to that. And Travis's character is Aubrey Little, aka Lady Flame, who is a street magician and has a rabbit named Dr. Bonkers. And she is a woman-loving woman. Not sure if she's like a lesbian or bi or what, but she's pretty great. And then Justin's character is Duck Newton, who is a park ranger, and the like playbook that he picked for his character is The Chosen. So he was like the chosen one, but he was like, no thanks. So he just, because Griffin, I think they said that Griffin said like, oh, don't pick like the chosen one thing because I don't want one of you guys to kind of be the main character. And then Justin was like, so I'm gonna pick it, but he's like, so it's like, oh, you get a vision again, and he's like, that was a weird dream. And then their dad is Ned Chicane, who owns the Cryptonomica, which is a cryptid museum, and like he just thinks everything in there is fake, but like some of the stuff is real, but he's, you know, he doesn't believe in all these weird monster things. And then they also do, I guess, the Adventure Zone Nights, which started, I guess, like 2 years ago, and they do it during the Max Fun Drive, which is Maximum Fun is the podcast network they're on, and the Max Fun Drive is when they like raise money. And so they do these episodes during that, and it's a game run by Travis, and it's Dungeons and Dragons, but it's more sci-fi, and Justin plays Troth, who is a tiefling monk. Tieflings are kind of these like demon-looking creatures. And she's badass. And then their dad plays Lenny Manolito, who is a human bard, and he's kind of skeevy. And then Griffin is Tom Collins, who is a half-elf warlock. And warlocks, their whole thing is basically they've like sold their soul to, you know, some eldritch god. But so he's like pretending to be a wizard.
With like and the whitest name ever.
Yeah. Tom Collins. And then in the most recent episode of Taz Nights, which is now almost a year ago, they had a special guest star, which they have really only ever had 2 guest stars on the show, and one of them was during a Adventure Zone live show, and then the other one is this one, and it's Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Lin-Manuel Miranda.
And he plays Canon, who is who starts as kind of like an NPC that Travis made up, and then they hand him over to Lynn for the episode that he's in, and he is also a human bard. And their dad was like, but I'm the bard. And Travis was like, how can I have Lin-Manuel Miranda on my show and not make him a bard? And it's like, that's so true. So he raps sometimes, because bards do magic with whatever their bardic thing is, so he raps. And it's great, because Lin-Manuel Miranda, and he has no idea how to play Dungeons & Dragons. Travis, like, made the character and sent it to him. And so, yeah, and I got to see them live at PodCon. Not Lin-Manuel Miranda, I wish. And they didn't do, like, the Adventure Zone live, but they did a Adventure Zone Zone, where they talked about it, and I saw my brother and me, and I got to meet them, and it was very cool. And then I made a paper D20 that they all signed, and it was really nerve-wracking. But yeah, so that's the Adventure Zone.
Cool.
I didn't know if I'd be able to talk about it for an hour, but I did.
You did.
I mean, a lot of that was us talking about not the Adventure Zone.
And by us, it's still mostly you.
Still mostly me. But
well, I have a representation question for you, Shannon.
sure. Yeah.
How, in your vast literary knowledge, how many asexual characters do you encounter?
Not a lot. The only ones that, like, I have encountered are ones that, like, I read this book because I knew there was an ace character in it.
Mm-hmm.
I just read a very good book called Tosh Hart's Tolstoy. And I knew about this book the moment it was announced because it is about an ace girl who makes a literary-inspired web series. And the author made a literary-inspired web series years ago. And she is not ace, but, you know, is involved in the web series community. And this book was announced, and Nicole and I were like, that's us! And so it was a really good book. And actually, it's interesting, I was talking earlier about, like, don't necessarily try to, like, write a book about representation that you haven't experienced. But actually, Tosh is a lot about being ace. And she's in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, like, a different from my experience. And, like, both making a web series and, like, figuring out ace stuff. But, you know, it's kind of like her trying to, you know, like, she kind of comes out to her friends, but in a way that, like, she doesn't totally explain it and they don't totally understand it. Which was, like, super realistic, where it's like, you know, not just for ace people, but for any people who have to, like, come out. It's like, you don't necessarily be like, okay, so, like, I'm asexual, this is what it means, and everyone's like, oh, okay. Like, it's a very awkward, clumsy thing where, like, she wasn't planning on it, and then she just kind of says, like, well, I don't know if, like, I'd want to date people or whatever, and then they're like, oh, okay, and they, like, don't know how to bring it up again, or if they should. So it was actually, like, very realistic, and it was very nice to read. I've read a few other books where character isn't necessarily, like, explicitly ace, but is maybe, like, you could interpret them that way. I read a book where I read, like, an ebook, I don't remember the name of it, but the girl is, like, a werewolf, and I think in the second book she says she might be, like, demisexual, which is on the asexual spectrum, and is, like, you're only attracted to people that you you develop, like, an emotional bond with. So that was interesting. So yeah, like, I don't encounter it a lot, and it is very much, I, like, follow people on Tumblr who will post, like, here is a book with an ace character. And then it does not pop up in, like, film or TV at all. I'm trying to think. There was a character in the show Sirens who was ace. Actually, I say was, I have no idea the status of that show. I think it only ran for, like, maybe it's still yeah, it ran for 2 seasons. I watched that episode, though. I didn't watch the rest of the show, but I watched that episode. And it was a cute episode. I feel like there's something else.
I mean, in Sherlock, they're portraying Sherlock as autistic and ace. Although I will say, Sherlock does not come across as an autistic ace sociopath in the original stories.
No. I'd say he does, but in a very different way from BBC Sherlock.
I mean, he could still, I guess, you know, ace, sure, he never really appears interested in anyone, but he's not a sociopath. No,
definitely not. He's very caring.
Yeah.
Just not necessarily always in the right way.
Yeah, he doesn't care about, like, rude people.
Yeah. Which is definitely lacking from a lot of Sherlock Holmes adaptations. I think especially recently there was more of a like trend of kind of those like Tony Stark like characters who are like, I don't care about anybody. I mean, obviously Tony Stark cares, but that's like obviously Sherlock cares, but Sherlock in the original books was more outwardly caring.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's characters like Sherlock, like I mentioned on Speak Beastie a lot, Newt Scamander. I'm like, he comes across as very autistic.
Oh, definitely autistic, yeah.
Because I remember before the movie, I was like, he's gonna be Ace. And then I watched the movie and I was like, he is autistic.
I mean, that's a whole other... a whole other representation.
Yeah.
Neuroatypical, is that the right phrase?
Yeah, or neurodivergent.
You know, and so you do have...
Which is something that I was thinking about when I was thinking about all this representation in the Adventure Zone, is there's not necessarily characters that I go like, oh, they're neurodivergent.
Yeah. Well, and
which...
I think some neurodivergence. For background, I work for a company that we do theater with adults with intellectual disabilities. So a lot of autism and Down syndrome. Mm-hmm. And a lot of disabilities do manifest physically. And so you couldn't have someone who doesn't have Down syndrome play someone with Down syndrome.
Yes.
And be at all accurate. Their autism is a huge spectrum of portrayal. And there are plenty of people, who, although, I work in a theater company and there are autistic people and they want to be on stage and stuff, but there are plenty of autistic people who want nothing to do with anyone and they wouldn't want to be in your movie.
Yeah.
So that's sort of, that does get into with some things you would need someone who has had that experience.
Well, and like stuff like that is interesting because, okay, like Newt Scamander is in the 20s. He wouldn't have been diagnosed as autistic. No. Because that wasn't a thing. And there's some things where it's like, I can look at a character and I'm like, that is an autistic character. But the writer isn't consciously thinking of them that way because they just think like, oh, this is like a weird, quirky person I've met in my life. Who might have been autistic, might not have been, but like, who wasn't necessarily diagnosed.
Yes.
Because especially autism is like, they're constantly kind of redefining it and figuring it out. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of like mental intellectual disabilities or just like mental illnesses that it's like, it's really hard to define and diagnose. And then like, unless someone like sends you to a therapist as a child or unless you actively seek out one, you're not necessarily going to be diagnosed.
Yeah, so that's a lot of it's, autism. I think it's the more extreme cases that get diagnosed because a teacher says something.
Yeah.
A teacher.
Or you're like, my child doesn't talk.
Yeah, my child doesn't, things that are really obvious. And it's, if it's just, well, my child's shy and my child is awkward, you don't necessarily want to be like, well, that's because their brain functions differently than other people's.
And especially like if that's your only child, like you don't, like you might know like, oh, this is a little weird, but that's just the thing about like raising any child is every child is different and you don't necessarily know like what is normal.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't raised a child and neither of you, but like,
no.
As far as I know, it's difficult, I guess.
From what I've heard.
Yeah.
I will say there's a show I watched, it was a long time ago, called Boston Legal, starring James Spader and William Shatner, and it is an excellent show. And it's very funny, and it's very liberal. But they have a, I guess he's not trans, but a cross-dressing character.
Uh-huh.
and they deal with, it's a law show, it's a law firm, and they deal with legal issues such as can he, when in his feminine persona, can he use the women's locker room, and things like that. And then there is eventually a character who's diagnosed as Asperger's, and he goes to therapy, and it's very extreme, and he has a lot of quirks. But he has Asperger's, and that is a part of his character, and a thing that he works to overcome, and deal with in the show.
Well, and that's, talking about, like, the definition is always, like, growing and changing. Technically, Asperger's is not, like, a thing anymore.
Yeah, it's no longer a diagnosis.
But, obviously, a lot of people have been diagnosed that way, and it's still used a lot. But that's, like, a problem with, like, autistic representation, is that usually it's white men.
That's true.
So, and it's like, you gotta diversify that a little bit.
But I did read an article once that was interesting. That was about how boys are diagnosed as autistic more often than girls are.
Yeah.
Because boys' autism tends to manifest more physically. And diverse men tend to manifest more physically, where women, it tends to be more internal. So it's, my daughter is shy.
Yeah. It's that, like, socialization.
Yeah. It's, they're quite, like, Shannen, as a child, just wanted to be in her room and not talk to anyone.
Yeah.
And we'd be like, come out, and she's like, no. If she answered you, it was no, I'm reading, I don't want to do that.
Well, then, like, our cousin, who's autistic, talks to everyone. I mean, I haven't seen him in a while, but like, as a child, he was very friendly.
Oh, yeah, Ben was really friendly, and he wanted to come, and he wanted to tell you all about his trading cards or whatever, and I had no idea what he was saying to me, but you're like, yeah, and he... so yeah, it was very different. They say, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism.
Yeah.
Although I did have a teacher I work with say, but when you've met 100 people with autism.
I actually read just one of my favorite books that I read last year. It's called On the Edge of God, and it is in the future. Basically, it's the world ends. And it's about this autistic mixed race girl. So she's, I think, like, half white, half black, but she looks black. So, and it's her and her mom and her transgender sister. And it's just kind of about them trying to get on this spaceship. There's all these spaceships that, like, are shelters, and then will theoretically, go off into space and wait until, like, the Earth is ready to be re-inhabited. Or try to find somewhere else.
Like WALL-E.
Yeah. But a lot of it is, 'cause the author who wrote it is autistic, and so a lot of it is about her... Because they basically end up on this ship, but it's like everyone has a job. And it's about her kind of trying to figure out, like, if she can be useful despite her disability. And it's kind of about, like, there's this, almost this, like, idea of, like, you're only, like, your existence is only worth it if you can, like, do something quote-unquote productive. But it's like, but she can't necessarily do the things that people expect her to do, or do the things that, other people can do. And so it's kind of like they're constantly at risk of getting kicked off this ship. Not just because of that, also because her mom is a drug addict and they're not supposed to be on the ship. But, like, she's very much like, if I can make myself useful, then they will keep me and keep my mom. It's a very good book.
That sounds interesting, yeah. Well, like, I love to talk about Shannen. Shannen's my favorite topic. All
I'm great.
conversations I have with people devolve into a conversation about Shannen. I don't know how or why, but
Even
they
this
do.
conversation is about me.
Yes. Well, when you're talking with Shannen, the conversation's definitely about Shannen. But, I do work with a lot of autistic people. And so I will use Shannen as an example because Shannen didn't want to talk to people for years.
Mm-hmm.
I like to tell the story about when Shannen was 16. That's when I got married, and Shannen was my maid of honor, and so she gave a speech. And she was very excited about giving a speech. Like, she wanted to give, that's really the only thing she did that was, like, maid of honor-esque.
Yeah.
I had another maid of honor who did all the things. And she didn't want to give a speech, so it worked out perfectly. But so Shannen was very excited about this speech, and she wrote this speech out and whatever. And it was hilarious. Shannen is very funny.
Best.
And my best friend's parents were like, I don't think I've ever heard Shannen talk. Much less that Shannen could be funny.
We had known them for how long?
I mean, years. She'd been my best friend since middle school, and they're like, I've never heard Shannen talk. Because you didn't talk to people unless you needed to. And now you work at Magic Kingdom, and you talk to people every day.
Yeah, it's like my job.
It's your job. You have to sell things to people.
Yeah, it's really annoying. I mean, I love it. I mean, I do, but that was a joke in case, like, someone who I work with listens. But I do actually like it.
That's good. And just because now I want to talk about me a little bit.
Yeah.
All of this will probably get cut out because it has nothing to do with the original topic. I have depression and anxiety, and I've had depression and anxiety my entire life. And so it's not, there are different types of depression. You can have a depressive episode where, like, something bad happens and you're sad and you're sadder than normal and you can get over it, or you can be depressed your entire life. I will have anxiety and depression my whole life, and I will be on medication my whole life. And there are times that it is difficult to function in the world. And, that's not something you see represented, that sort of depression. You see people, it's like, oh, my father died and I'm depressed. And that's, legit. But you don't see someone where it's as much, where it's like, I just have a hard time convincing myself to get up some days.
Yeah.
And some days it's just like halfway through the day and it's like, man, I want to cry and go home. I don't have a reason, but I just do. Or like, I can't fall asleep because I am panicking over something really random that I cannot do anything about. But right now, I am fixated on it. Yeah. And, I think, and probably, the thing with representation of, like, mental health things and neurodiverse things are that a lot of times you don't realize you know someone.
Yeah.
And so it's not thought of to represent because you don't realize that that person that you know is depressed all the time because they don't tell you, because they're concerned that you will judge them.
Yeah, like, people are socialized to, don't let people see this weird thing about you.
Yeah. You always want to come across as normal.
Yeah. Well, The Adventure Zone is a good show. Well, to kind of connect it, like, The Adventure Zone is, like, my special interest, which is what is often the term for, like, the fixation. Like, autistic people often get, like, fixated on, like, special interests. I don't know how to use other words, but The Adventure Zone is, like, the thing that I'm really, really into right now, and have been since, like, March of last year, I guess.
I think that's probably why autistic people are also often labeled as nerds, because they're like, well, I really like Doctor Who. Not like,
Yeah.
oh, I like to watch Doctor Who, but like I dress up as Doctor Who and go to a convention
like,
where I am surrounded by people. I say this as someone, I have a TARDIS costume and I go to conventions and meet Doctor Who people. And I would say that both Shannon and I become easily fixated on things that we really, really like, and it consumes our entire lives.
Yeah. I mean, I went to PodCon in Seattle, which is like, it's the furthest I've ever gone by myself, but I wouldn't have gone there if I hadn't gone into the Adventure Zone. Like I liked a lot of people who were there, and like, I, enjoyed myself for other reasons than just like the Adventure Zone, but I wouldn't have gotten as into like the podcasting community.
Which is interesting when you think about it, how much is like, don't be obsessed with this thing is so discouraged, but it's like that can be such a social thing. Yeah. You can find, if you're obsessed with Doctor Who, there's a Doctor Who thing in front of me, that's why you could find other people who are obsessed with Doctor Who, and maybe you only sit and watch Doctor Who together and you don't talk, but you are in the room with another human being, so like that's cool. I like to, Shannon and I always say we are shy around the people we know. Not like the people you're really close with, but like those acquaintance people where you're like, do I talk to them? Do they think I'm weird? But I could get up in front of a crowded room and talk to them about Harry Potter for hours and have in fact done that. And so is Shannon. We've presented at conventions because that's not a problem.
And probably another part of that is like our parents were in theater and then got us into theater, and so like we grew up doing theater camp or classes, and so we always knew how to talk in front of a crowd.
But that's
because we acted in front of a crowd.
Where I work, that's the whole point, is that you're teaching people how to talk and how to socialize. You're in this group and you are making this show together, and you are then gonna go on stage and perform it in front of people. And we use testimonials all the time of people being like, ArtStream has changed my life. And it's not related to podcasts, but podcasts are cool, and I sometimes listen to one of them.
Mine.
Yep, the one that you're on, and sometimes also Night Vale. But I'm very far behind on both.
It's okay. It's hard to keep up with podcasts. Well, shall you tell us some pop culture history?
Yeah. I plugged in my phone, but I think I remember it.
Okay.
On this month in pop culture history, on February 4th, 1938, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered. By Walt Disney, as I think everyone knows, the first full-length animated feature film. It was important and it was cool, and it got a big premiere, and Minnie and Mickey were there, and Snow White and dwarves were there, and Walt Disney got a special Oscar for it with one big statue and 7 little statues presented by Shirley Temple.
So that was 80 years ago.
Yep, yes. So it definitely was 38 because it was 80 years ago.
Yeah.
I remember that it was it's its 80th anniversary. So Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
It's very cool. Well, thanks everyone for listening.
I hope that people listen.
This was a very long one. You can follow us on Twitter, twitter.com/popculturepie, Tumblr, popculturepie.tumblr.com, and Facebook, facebook.com/popculturepie. And you can email us if you want to at popculturepiecast@gmail.com, and donate to Remarkable Singular Curious, which is our production company, at patreon.com/RSC. I've been Shannon.
And I'm still Colleen. May the force be with you.